Now we're on Big 12 again, and I have not talked about Colorado enough the past couple weeks. Last month or so, I did a review on Colorado, and one of the things I was concerned about was the depth on their team, particularly the amount of injuries that they had, and most importantly, their offensive line. But I gotta say, I was totally wrong about this team, and for those people who've watched the old video and know which one I'm talking about, I was definitely a little reluctant to say that they would turn the corner. I mean, if you look at their past history, obviously they were 1-11 in 2022 when Dion, the season before Dion took over. 10 of those games where they lost by 20 or more points. Then obviously last season you had 4-8, which obviously to be expected too. I mean, there's always some growing pains when you're having a new program and you're implementing your style and your vision and your identity and all those different things too. And obviously with the media sensationalizing every little thing that you do, that's always is going to be part of the story. And now here we are, thinking that was going to be kind of the same story as last year, but it turns out that they're 7-2 right now, 5-1 in Big 12 play, and they deserve so much credit for what they've done too. And I've said this over and over again about Colorado. Colorado plays better when they're the underdog, and I really love Deion Sanders' quote from last week after their win versus Cincinnati. In essence, saying like, "Hey, we don't want all the glitter and fame. We would rather be the team that you guys don't talk about. That way, when they do win, it can slowly but steadily, be that presence, be that force that can make some noise in a Big 12 title game or a college football playoff, depending how some of these things unravel too. And especially after watching the BYU versus Utah game, Colorado still has a long shot at getting in too. So I mean, you don't have to completely dismiss them too. But in terms of this episode, I'm going to briefly expand on what they did versus Texas Tech to get the victory, and most importantly, in a more grant and more macro sort of scheme, what they've done, what changes that they've made that have ultimately seen the success that they have at the moment. Obviously watching the Texas Tech game, you know, it got a little ugly at the beginning, particularly, just a lot of kind of reckless play, not too much defense. Texas Tech came out pretty hot too. I mean, in the first quarter, up by 2 possessions, really getting to Shedeur Sanders, and it was stagnant. They weren't getting a lot of things going. Obviously, the sort of one-dimensional offense that they've always had, even though they're always a threat, and they're always getting big plays and things like that too. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself, have those moments. It's one of those things where you know can Pat Shermer and that offensive staff make those necessary adjustments that get them in those places where they get victories. I mean, obviously for those you don't know, I mean, Texas Tech has been one of the worst defenses in the entire country besides Oklahoma State. That's what both those teams have in common, is neither of those two teams can play defense. However, they're completely electric on the offense side of the ball. And you saw a lot of that this week. Texas Tech gave up a lot of big plays. You have the incumbent, I guess, Heisman Trophy candidate. Obviously, it's a debate between him and Gentry, obviously. But when you have Travis Hunter, he had 9 receptions for 99 yards and 1 touchdown. Already has 5 games with over 100 yards. 100 yards receiving. I mean, since he had 99, I mean, hey, what the hell? You might as well give him 6, right? But he's 86 for 87 snaps on the defensive side of the ball, did all the snaps on the offensive side of the ball. And then for special teams, I think it was for the majority of the snaps there too. So it's a testament to the adjustments that Colorado has made throughout the season. That was one of my major complaints about them, is is can Colorado put this all together? I mean, they do have a lot of talent there, and obviously building through the portal is always going to be a question mark that Colorado has to deal with when you decide you're going to bring in 40, 50 guys from the transfer portal and sort of cycle players out who you don't see as your long-term vision. Yes, there are going to be immediate questions about what's the longevity of this? Can you actually build a program this way? What does that say to
potential high school recruits coming in who say to themselves, hey, as a high schooler, and if I don't get playing time, say, hey, my freshman, sophomore year, are they gonna kick me to the curb and then I have to go, transfer to a whole nother school and start my degree all over again? Those are the types of questions that, you know, Dion has had to face, throughout the season too, because, in the second year, obviously the expectations are way higher too. And the Big 12 is only going to get more competitive too. And, even looking back at the beginning of the season, I mean, the Colorado was just not one of those teams where, we were necessarily sitting there saying, they could possibly make a run at the Big 12 title. In my head, the teams I had on my radar were Kansas State, Oklahoma State, and Utah. But it goes to show, you know, how much Colorado has improved over the season. And, I'll be the first one to admit on the show, I've not given them enough credit. I've obviously talked about some of the positives. Like, I've always been a Pat Shermer guy. I've always believed that he doesn't get enough credit for, some of the schemes and some of the things he draws up, particularly in the red zone where they had five touchdowns and, you know, putting Shedeur Sanders in a place to succeed, right? Because one of the things that was ultimately derailing Colorado from being more of a balanced team was the fact that offensive line really couldn't protect him. And when you have a quarterback who's not protected, I don't care how experienced he is, he's not going to be able to go through those progressions. His idea is okay. If Travis Hunter's not there, what about Wester or Will Shepard or any of those guys too, who, by the way, have definitely made a significant impact. That's the one thing I have been noticing as I've been watching Colorado football these past couple weeks, and it definitely came a lot more to light versus the Texas Tech game, is the fact that when you saw him be a little bit more giving to some of these other receivers, it definitely opens up the door to your entire playbook as well. And, it takes less pressure off Travis Hunter, right? Because yes, I mean, obviously he is the Heisman Trophy candidate, and yes, he had some lingering injury issues, but as we're coming to the final stretch of the season, you know, you teams are going to know your strengths and weaknesses. Teams are going to have the entire week to go back and watch 2.5-3 months of college football film, and they're going to know what you do. They're going to know what your strengths are. They're going to know what your weaknesses are. They're going to know your injury report inside and out. And when you have all those things all coming together, it's definitely a lot of those attention to detail sort of things, the fundamentals, the basics that a lot of the time will be the reason why one team gets in the college football playoff or one team wins the game and the other one doesn't too. Because even in general too, I mean, I go back to this over and over again. I mean, obviously Colorado's defense was not what you wanted it to be the first couple weeks. I mean, it was, in essence, it was almost like watching a Miami game in the sense, okay, the final score of this game is going to be 38-35 or 45-42 or something to that effect. But as I was watching this Texas Tech game, obviously they came off a big win versus Iowa State last week. They had Byron Morton back, who is a stud and a lot of fun to watch. And he's a gunslinger too. He knows where to find his targets and all of that too. But to me, the big story of this game was the defensive line. As much as the secondary, did their thing back there and held things down from the third quarter on, where Colorado really got a lot of that momentum. To me, the big story was the defensive line. Up the first 4 or 5 weeks, you really didn't see much from them. And granted, obviously when you play a faster pace of football, your defense naturally is going to be out there a little bit longer. And yes, there is a part of that issue there. But at the same time, I think this is one of the first weeks that really comes to mind where I sat there and said to myself, man, this Colorado defensive line can really get to the quarterback and really cause some havoc back there, when they're put in the right situation. And I said this before about Robert Livingston, first time really calling plays as a defensive coordinator, but man, has he done a phenomenal job with this group. And when you looked at him on paper, you kind of said to yourself, hey, maybe they'll, the schedule's not too bad, and you have Shedeur, you have Travis Hunter, you have these playmakers who could bail you out in certain situations. But when you're playing Power Four football and you play these teams every week who are relatively consistent for the most part. I mean, I just routed off like Kansas State and BYU and all these teams. No matter what week it is, you can never count those teams out. That's the same thing with Utah too. Utah fought BYU to the wire and they still lost that. But at the same time, regardless of what that record tells you, you always have to play those teams tough. And Colorado really doesn't really have a lot of gimme games on that schedule. I mean, granted, can they definitely win out? Absolutely. I definitely, you can make the argument that they can win out too. But I would not be surprised if this Utah game could be a little bit tougher than people expect, especially after watching this week. I mean, obviously Brandon Rose and this quarterback there and the offensive staff are going to have to make some adjustments if they really have any shot at beating Colorado. But as a Colorado fan, I mean, if you're a Colorado fan, you have to be pretty freaking excited about what you see after what's been really, let's just say, the past decade or so of just a lot of frustration, a lot of inconsistency, players being kind of in and out. And do we know what's going to happen with Deion after this season? Who knows? And I don't want to speculate about that with it being so far out at the same time. But in the right here and now situation, I mean, hey, give Deion Sanders for credit for motivating this team, and really doubling down on this dark horse moniker that he's been preaching to this team throughout the year. Because obviously they're in the top 20 right now. They deserve all the credit that they have. But now the lights are on you now. When push comes to shove and you have expectations now, and you've proven a lot of people wrong. It's can you continue building that momentum in a way that translates to a Big 12 championship game or possibly a college football playoff? Because I would argue, I had them maybe at 6 or 7 wins this year. So I would say regardless of how these next couple games turn out, I think you have to be excited for the future in terms of this Colorado program. Now, granted, that's obviously assuming that Deion comes back and he keeps his word about Shedeur Sanders kind of moving on to the NFL and not having Daddy there right by his side. But at the same time, I stated the positives. I mean, you have the marketability of Deion Sanders when Travis Hunter and Sanders and Shiloh, when they all eventually go and do their own thing. So, you can build the program that way. And, obviously, at the beginning of the year, a lot of what we saw was pretty stagnant in the sense of, the defensive front not being where you want to be. But as time progresses, I mean, because you don't necessarily need their running game to be enough to necessarily take over games. But at the same time, what I did notice in that game is Texas Tech every once in a while put enough people into the box to the point where they respected it. And that's really all the point that Colorado has to be. I get the identity is Shedeur throwing for 250 to 350 a game, having two or three touchdowns, using his mobility to extend plays and get guys open. But at the same time, we're at the point now where you've proven that you can win some games. You've faced a lot of respectable teams now, and I think this is really where you continue to build that momentum, and you really do see if Colorado can continue making some noise. But if you're Colorado right now, you got to be impressed with what you've done, and you're definitely at a point where you're building a lot of momentum moving forward for the end of this season.